Whispers echoed through the grand hall as Cedric publicly rejected his fated mate, leaving Isabella humiliated in the dirt. Mockery filled the air, but their cruel laughter died instantly when the Northern Kingdom's ruthless ruler dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to her scarred hand in absolute submission. Winter gripped the sprawling medieval estate of Oakhaven with an unforgiving chill. Frost clung to the iron-wrought gates and the heavy stone walls of the central keep, mirroring the cold hearts of the nobility that resided within. In this harsh hierarchy, worth was dictated by lineage, strength, and the purity of one's wolf. Isabella possessed none of these, or so they believed. Orphaned during the brutal skirmishes of the southern valleys, she had been taken in by Lord Harrington, not out of charity, but to serve as an unpaid scullery maid. She was 20 years old, yet her wolf had never surfaced. To the elite, she was completely invisible, a mere shadow scrubbing the cobblestone floors while wearing ragged linen. On the eve of the lunar equinox, Oakhaven was alive with a feverish energy. The great hall was draped in emerald banners and lit by hundreds of roaring hearths. Tonight was the mating ceremony, a sacred medieval tradition where the unmarried wolves of noble bloodlines sought the blessing of the moon goddess. Cedric, the future alpha of Oakhaven, stood at the center of the dais. He was a striking figure, broad-shouldered and draped in a heavy velvet cloak, clasped with solid silver. His arrogance was legendary, matched only by his prowess on the battlefield. The entire pack expected him to mate with Lady Beatrice of House Montgomery, a stunning she-wolf with a pedigree as spotless as her snow-white fur. Isabella had no place at the feast. Her duties confined her to the shadows, carrying heavy wooden trays of roasted venison and spiced wine to the raucous nobles. She kept her head down, her unruly dark hair hiding the exhaustion etched into her delicate features. Her hands, calloused and scarred from years of manual labor, trembled slightly under the weight of an iron goblet tray. Suddenly, a heavy silence fell over the great hall. The ceremonial drumbeats ceased. Cedric had stepped down from the dais, his eyes completely glazed over, as the scent of his fated mate finally hit him. The crowd held its collective breath. Beatrice smoothed down her silk gown, a triumphant smile playing on her lips as she prepared to step forward and claim her prize. But Cedric walked right past Beatrice. He moved like a man possessed, navigating through the maze of long oak tables, his nostrils flaring. His gaze locked onto the darkest corner of the room, near the servants' entrance. Isabella froze. The iron tray in her hands felt impossibly heavy. A burning sensation flared in her chest, an ancient primal pull that connected her soul directly to the towering alpha approaching her. The scent of pine and crisp winter air enveloped her, intoxicating and overwhelming. They were mates. The moon goddess had paired the future alpha of Oakhaven with the lowest servant in his household. When Cedric finally stopped in front of her, the realization dawned on him. The glazed look of destiny in his eyes shattered, replaced instantly by unadulterated disgust. He looked at her soot-stained apron, her worn leather shoes, and her dirt-smudged cheeks. Gasps rippled through the hall. Lord Harrington dropped his chalice, the wine spilling like a dark stain across the pristine floor. Her. Cedric's voice was a low, dangerous growl that carried to every corner of the silent room. He did not whisper. He wanted everyone to hear. The goddess offers me a wolfless beggar. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked up into his eyes, hoping to find a shred of the inherent mate-bond affection, but found only a wall of ice. Cedric. She breathed the name, tasting foreign on her tongue. Do not speak my name, peasant. Cedric spat, stepping back as if her very presence was an infectious disease. He turned to face the shocked assembly, his expression hardening into a cruel sneer. He locked eyes with Beatrice, who was watching the scene with a mixture of horror and rising amusement. I am Cedric of Oakhaven, he announced, his voice booming with authority. "I am destined to lead the greatest army in the Midlands. I require a Luna who commands respect, who brings strength to our bloodline, and who can stand beside me in the inevitable wars to come. I will not tether my soul to a weak, pathetic creature who cannot even shift." Isabella felt the words like physical blows. The bond between them, fragile and newly formed, screamed in agony. Cedric turned back to her, his eyes devoid of mercy. "I, Cedric, future Alpha of Oakhaven, officially and unequivocally reject you, Isabella. I sever this bond. You are nothing to me, and you will never be my Luna." The rejection tore through Isabella's chest like a jagged blade. The magical tether connecting their souls snapped, sending a shockwave of sheer agony through her nervous system. She dropped the iron tray. Goblets shattered wine splashing over her shoes. Her knees buckled, and she hit the hard stone floor, gasping for breath, as the physical pain of a broken bond racked her small frame. For a moment, the hall was dead silent. Then someone snickered. It was Beatrice. The noblewoman stepped forward, wrapping a slender arm around Cedric's bicep. The snicker grew into a laugh, and soon the entire great hall erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. Lords and ladies pointed at the girl writhing on the floor, finding her misery deeply entertaining. Isabella bit her lip until she tasted copper. She refused to scream. She refused to give them the satisfaction of her absolute destruction. Shaking violently, she gathered her meager strength and pushed herself off the cold stones. She did not cry. Instead, she lifted her chin, her green eyes flashing with a sudden, unreadable defiance. She looked at Cedric, who was already turning his back on her to kiss Beatrice's hand. Without a word, Isabella turned and limped out of the great hall, leaving the laughter of the nobility echoing behind her. They laughed because they thought she was broken. They laughed because they believed they had seen the last of her relevance. They had no idea what was coming. 3 weeks passed since the humiliation at the lunar equinox. True to his word, Cedric had moved quickly to secure an alliance with House Montgomery, announcing his impending marriage to Beatrice. Isabella was banished to the outermost stables, forbidden from entering the main keep, so that her presence would not offend the future Luna. She spent her days mucking out stalls, and her nights shivering under a thin woolen blanket, nursing the lingering ache in her chest. However, a sudden panic had recently gripped Oakhaven, overshadowing Cedric's wedding preparations. A messenger had arrived on a dying horse, with terrifying news: King Alaric Vane was marching south. Alaric was a name spoken only in hushed, terrified whispers. He was the supreme Alpha King of the Frosthold, a man who had conquered the treacherous northern territories and united the feral packs under his iron fist. He was not just a leader. He was a force of nature, a monstrous lichen whose wolf was rumored to be twice the size of a normal beast. He ruled with absolute authority and demanded heavy tributes from the southern territories. He was stopping at Oakhaven to collect his due, and Lord Harrington was terrified. If Oakhaven displeased the king, Alaric would not hesitate to raze the entire estate to the bare earth. The entire pack was mobilized to prepare for the king's arrival. The cobblestones were scrubbed until they gleamed, the finest tapestries were hung, and a feast of unimaginable proportions was prepared. Cedric saw this as an opportunity to prove his worth, hoping to secure a position as one of Alaric's top regional generals. He stood at the front of the courtyard, polished armor, gleaming in the pale winter sun, with Beatrice clinging proudly to his side. The ground began to tremble before the king even appeared. The heavy thud of massive paws echoed through the valley. Through the heavy iron gates rode the northern vanguard, sitting astride monstrous direwolves rather than horses. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to plummet, a biting frost creeping over the stones. Then King Alaric arrived. He rode a magnificent pitch-black warhorse, but he needed no beast to make him look imposing. Alaric was a titan of a man, clad in dark, heavy leathers and furs. A jagged scar ran down the left side of his jaw, and his eyes were the color of a raging winter storm, a piercing icy blue that seemed to strip the soul bare. An aura of pure, suffocating dominance radiated from him. Lower-ranking wolves in the courtyard involuntarily whimpered their knees, buckling under the sheer weight of his alpha aura. Even Cedric swallowed hard, his arrogant posture faltering as a bead of sweat rolled down his neck. Alaric dismounted in one fluid motion. Lord Harrington immediately dropped to one knee, followed hastily by Cedric Beatrice and the rest of the nobility. "Your Grace," Harrington stammered, keeping his eyes glued to the dirt. "Oakhaven welcomes you. We are honored to host the Supreme Alpha. We have prepared a grand feast and our finest quarters." Alaric did not even look at him. The king stood perfectly still in the center of the courtyard, his broad chest rising and falling. His icy eyes narrowed, and his nostrils flared slightly. He was ignoring the groveling lords entirely. In the far corner of the courtyard, hidden behind a stack of hay bales near the stables, Isabella was hauling a bucket of freezing water. She had been strictly ordered to stay out of sight, but the moment Alaric had entered the gates, a strange sensation had washed over her. The lingering, dull pain in her chest from Cedric's rejection suddenly vanished, replaced by an inferno of warmth. Her heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, wild forest hit her senses so hard she nearly dropped the bucket. Alaric took a step forward. The crowd parted, instantly terrified of being in his path. Cedric, desperate to gain the king's attention, scrambled to his feet and stepped into Alaric's trajectory. "My king, allow me to introduce my future Lunar Lady Beatrice. We are eager to serve your vanguard," and Alaric's hand shot out with terrifying speed, grabbing Cedric by the throat. He didn't squeeze, but the threat was abundantly clear. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the future Alpha of Oakhaven aside like a rag doll. Cedric crashed into the mud, gasping for air, thoroughly humiliated in front of his entire pack. The king continued walking his heavy boots, crunching against the frost. He marched past the nobles, past the lavish gifts, and headed straight for the mud-soaked perimeter of the stables. Isabella stood frozen, the heavy wooden bucket slipping from her scarred hands. Water spilled over her boots, but she couldn't move. The most feared man on the continent was walking directly toward her. As Alaric stopped mere inches away, the height difference was staggering. He towered over her small, frail frame. The crowd in the courtyard watched in dead silence, horrified. Lord Harrington held his breath, convinced the beggar girl had somehow offended the king and was about to be slaughtered. Cedric picked himself up from the mud, a cruel smirk returning to his face, expecting Alaric to execute the useless servant for daring to make eye contact. Alaric stared down at Isabella. He took in her ragged clothes, the soot on her face, and the red raw scars on her hands from years of forced labor. His icy blue eyes softened, melting into an ocean of profound reverence. The suffocating, terrifying aura of the Alpha King retracted, completely replaced by a deep, protective warmth that wrapped around Isabella like a heavy blanket. Slowly, deliberately, King Alaric Vane sank to the muddy ground. He dropped to one knee, the armor on his leg clanking against the cold stone. He reached out with massive leather-clad hands, and gently as if handling spun glass, took Isabella's scarred, dirty hand in his own. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against her knuckles, in a traditional ancient display of absolute submission, a gesture meant only for an alpha offering his life to his fated mate. "My queen." Alaric's deep, rumbling voice echoed through the silent courtyard, vibrating with raw emotion. "I have searched across 3 continents for you. Who has dared to treat you this way?" The silence that followed was deafening. The nobility of Oakhaven stood paralyzed, their minds unable to process the impossible sight before them. The arrogant lords who had laughed, The cruel women who had mocked, and Cedric who had thrown her away like garbage, all watched their worst nightmare unfold. The wolfless servant they had tormented wasn't just a fated mate. She was the absolute queen of the North, and the monster kneeling before her was going to burn their world to the ground for what they had done. Utter disbelief paralyzed the residents of Oakhaven. The biting winter wind howled through the stone battlements, but down in the muddy courtyard, time had entirely stopped. King Alaric Vane, the towering conqueror, who had brought entire empires to their knees, remained kneeling in the freezing sludge before a ragged servant. He gently ran his thumbs over the harsh raised scars on Isabella's palms. His icy blue eyes darkened with a turbulent storm of sorrow and rising fury. Isabella stared down at the massive lichen, her mind, struggling to comprehend the reality unfolding before her. The agonizing void left by Cedric's cruel rejection was rapidly filling with an intense, radiating warmth. The scent of wild pine and wood smoke overwhelmed her senses, soothing the jagged edges of her shattered soul. "My king," Lord Harrington finally stammered, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. His aristocratic lineage proudly tracing back to the ancient and wealthy house of Plantagenet usually afforded him unshakable confidence, but today his voice squeaked like a cornered mouse. There must be some profound misunderstanding. This girl is a nobody. She is a wolfless stray taken in out of mere charity. She cannot possibly be the Queen of the North. Alaric did not rise immediately. Instead, he unclasped the heavy obsidian black direwolf fur from his broad shoulders. With absolute reverence, he wrapped the luxurious, impossibly warm cloak around Isabella's shivering frame, cocooning her against the harsh winter chill. Only then did he stand unfolding his massive height until he loomed over the entire assembly like a vengeful god. A misunderstanding. Alaric's voice was a soft, deadly rumble that vibrated through the cobblestones, causing the direwolves at the gates to bare their fangs in unison. He turned his terrifying gaze upon Lord Harrington. "My wolf recognizes its other half. My soul recognizes its anchor. But what I also recognize, Lord Harrington, is the lingering stench of a severed mate bond clinging to her spirit." The king's nostrils flared, his chest expanding, as he drew in a deep breath of the courtyard's frigid air. His eyes snapped directly toward Cedric, who was still brushing mud from his polished armor. The color drained entirely from Cedric's face. "Who did this?" Alaric demanded, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the lethal weight of an incoming avalanche. "Who dared to snap the sacred tether of the moon goddess, who forced my mate to endure the agony of a broken bond?" Panic erupted among the nobles. They began to shrink back desperately, trying to distance themselves from Cedric. Beatrice, previously clinging to Cedric's arm like a prized trophy, violently shoved herself away from him, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Cedric swallowed hard, his arrogant facade crumbling into dust. "Your Grace." He choked out his knees, trembling. She was wolfless, a weak link. Oakhaven requires strength. The historical texts of the Bavarian lichen ancestry dictate that a pack must purge its weak to survive. I was merely doing what was best for my people. I rejected her before you knew she belonged to me. Alaric interrupted, closing the distance between them in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Cedric by the breastplate, lifting the future alpha entirely off the ground. Cedric's legs kicked uselessly in the air, his heavy armor offering no protection against the monstrous strength of the Northern King. "You did not reject her because you sought strength." Alaric sneered, his fangs elongating past his lips. "You rejected her because your pathetic inferior wolf could not sense the dormant royalty standing right in front of you. You are blind, arrogant, and thoroughly unworthy of the title you claim to hold." Isabella watched from the safety of Alaric's cloak, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For years she had been told she was nothing. She had scrubbed their floors, eaten their scraps, and endured their endless mockery. Yet here was the most terrifying lichen in existence, holding her chief tormentor aloft like a misbehaving pup. "Put him down," Isabella said. Her voice was quiet, rusty, from years of keeping her head bowed and her words swallowed. Alaric paused. He slowly turned his head to look at her, the lethal rage in his eyes softening the instant they locked onto hers. "He is not worth the stain on your hands, my king," she continued, stepping forward. The heavy fur cloak trailed behind her on the frost-covered ground, but she no longer looked like a beggar. Supported by the overwhelming power of her true mate's aura, Isabella stood taller, her green eyes burning with a sudden fierce emerald light. Alaric complied instantly. He opened his hand, letting Cedric crash back into the mud in a pathetic heap of tangled limbs and dented metal. The king immediately returned to Isabella's side, resting a protective heavy hand against the small of her back. "He is yours to punish, my queen," Alaric murmured for all the courtyard to hear. "Speak the word, and I will command my vanguard to reduce Oakhaven to ash and memory. No stone will stand. No member of this pack will see the next sunrise." Gasps of horror rippled through the nobility. Lord Harrington fell to his knees, openly weeping and begging for mercy. Cedric clawed his way up, his pride entirely shattered, realizing that his life, his inheritance, and his kingdom now rested entirely in the scarred hands of the servant he had thrown away. Isabella surveyed the grovelling lords and ladies. These were the same people who had laughed uproariously as she writhed on the stone floor of the great hall just weeks prior. They had cheered for her destruction. Now they were weeping in the mud, terrified of the very shadow she cast. "Stand up, Cedric," Isabella commanded, her voice ringing out with a newfound startling authority. Cedric hesitated, looking up at the hulking figure of Alaric, before slowly climbing to his feet. He couldn't meet her gaze, his eyes fixed firmly on the muddy tips of her ruined boots. "You claimed I was weak," Isabella stated, walking slowly toward him. The closer she moved to Alaric, the more an intense electric pressure built up inside her veins. The lifelong block in her mind, the heavy iron door that had kept her wolf locked away, was beginning to splinter under the sheer force of Alaric's protective alpha energy. "You claimed I was wolfless, but you were wrong." A sudden blinding pain shot down Isabella's spine, causing her to arch backward with a sharp gasp. Alaric was there in a heartbeat, catching her before she could fall. He didn't look panicked. Instead, a look of profound awe washed over his rugged features. "Let it out, little bird," Alaric whispered fiercely against her ear. "The northern winds have come to carry you home. Break your chains." The electric pressure inside Isabella exploded. A brilliant, blinding silver light erupted from her form, forcing the Oakhaven pack to shield their eyes. The sound of snapping bones and shifting anatomy echoed through the courtyard, but it was not accompanied by screams of pain. Instead, a magnificent melodic howl tore from Isabella's throat, a sound so pure and ancient that it sent shivers down the spine of every lichen present. When the silver light faded, the beggar girl was gone. Standing in her place was a beast of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. Isabella's wolf was enormous, nearly rivaling Alaric's monstrous size. Her fur was a pristine, shimmering silver, glowing with an ethereal luminescence that cast long, stark shadows across the cobblestones. But it was her eyes that commanded absolute submission, vibrant, glowing emeralds that held the ancient wisdom and power of a direct descendant of the moon goddess herself. She was a royal silver, a mythical creature long thought to be extinct, chronicled only in the oldest grimoires of the European highlands. She hadn't been wolfless. Her inner beast had simply refused to answer to an inferior alpha like Cedric. She had been dormant, waiting for a mate powerful enough to match her celestial frequency. Isabella padded forward, her massive paws completely silent on the frost. She stopped directly in front of Cedric, looking down at him. Cedric fell backward, scrambling away like a terrified child. His own wolf whimpered pathetically in his mind instantly, forcing him to bare his neck in ultimate submission to the royal standing over him. Beside him, Beatrice was pressed flat against the ground, sobbing into the dirt. Isabella did not attack. She merely huffed a plume of silver mist escaping her jaws and turned her back on him. She had proven her point. To kill him would be a mercy he did not deserve. Leaving him to live with the crippling knowledge of what he had thrown away was a far superior punishment. She trotted back to Alaric, nudging her massive silver head against his chest. The Alpha King smiled a rare, breathtaking expression that transformed his harsh features. He reached out, burying his hands in her glowing fur. "Beautiful," he rumbled. Alaric turned back to the trembling Lord Harrington. "Oakhaven will not burn today." The king declared, his voice carrying absolute finality. "My queen is merciful. But hear my decree. Oakhaven is stripped of its sovereignty. You will pay triple the standard tribute to the Frosthold, and your borders will be governed by my northern generals. As for Cedric, he is permanently stripped of his alpha heir status. He will live out his days in the outer settlements, forbidden from ever entering this keep again." Lord Harrington bowed so low his forehead touched the mud. "Yes, your grace. Thank you for your mercy, Queen Isabella." Alaric stepped up to his massive black warhorse. Isabella shifted back to her human form, behind the safety of the direwolf cloak, feeling more alive and powerful than she ever had in her 20 years of existence. She was no longer a servant, no longer a victim, and no longer a ghost in the shadows. Alaric lifted her effortlessly onto the saddle before vaulting up behind her. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, taking the reins. The northern vanguard fell into formation. Behind them, their monstrous dire wolves letting out a synchronized, earth-shaking howl of victory. As they rode out of the heavy iron gates of Oakhaven, Isabella looked back one final time. She saw Cedric stripped of his armor, kneeling alone in the mud, while the rest of the pack turned their backs on him. The cruel lords and ladies who had mocked her were now left to face a bleak, impoverished future under the strict rule of the North. Isabella leaned back against Alaric's broad, solid chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The winter chill no longer bothered her. She had found her mate, her power, and her throne. They laughed when her bond was broken, but now the entire world would bow to the Silver Queen of the Frosthold. Did you love this tale of ultimate revenge and true destiny? The moon goddess always ensures the right paths cross, even if it requires shattering the wrong ones first. If Isabella's triumphant transformation and King Alaric's fierce devotion kept you hooked, hit that like button to support our stories. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more epic werewolf dramas, royal twists, and fated mate sagas.